Well, I think we're ready to get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees. I'm Steve Joseph, Vice President of Business Development here at ShareVault, and I'd like to welcome and thank each of you for your interest in today's presentation. This webinar, Pharma and Biotech Needs a New Financing Model, is the fifth presentation in our continuing ShareVault webinar series. Before we start, I'd like to mention that there will be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation, but because of the size of the audience, we can really only accept written questions that you can submit through the question box on your screen, if you can see that. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the session. I also want to let you know that a recording of this presentation will be available on ShareVault's website, www.sharevault.com, in the next few days. And finally, Duane's slides will be available for downloading. As soon as we can get it set up, you'll receive an invitation to a ShareVault data room where you'll be able to download the slides without any restrictions. So now it's time to start today's presentation. We're honored and excited to have Duane Roth, Connect CEO, as our guest speaker today. Duane's topic has clearly generated significant interest, which I think reflects the industry's continuing concern and attention to the cost-effectiveness of new drug development. There's probably mention of this topic in articles, blogs, and other media weekly, if not more frequently than that. Duane, thank you for joining us today. We very much appreciate your giving this presentation, and we're looking forward to hearing your vision, and I think we're ready to get started.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to ShareVault for inviting me to give this webinar. When I chose the title, I had a stronger word than doomed, but they modified it. But it really is time for us to start to consider what the financing models are going to be in the future, and that's what I want to mostly address with you today. There are other issues that we can talk about, and they're related, but in addition to the financing model, there's the efficiency of what I call production, and that is how we develop data, how we use that data, and then even in through preclinical, clinical manufacturing, that part of the development pipeline. And then the third one that I won't spend a lot of time on today, but the need to prepare the workforce. And the topic there is really the dearth of entry-level jobs because of where the innovation is happening and what we might do to address that. So I won't get into a great deal on that today, but it's very important that it get mentioned. So I'd like to begin with some generalities about the models that we've used in this country to finance innovation, to develop products and services that have really changed the face of American innovation and the American economy. And by that, I recite you a few statistics that I don't have a slide on, but in the late 1800s, 90% of Americans were employed in agriculture. That number by 1900 was 45%, and by the middle of the last century, 1950s, that had dropped to 14%, and today it's 1%. And all of that is productivity gains because we produce more food at a lower cost than we ever have since any time in our country's history. Same thing is happening in so many aspects, and therefore the job area is one that we have to all be collectively concerned about and make sure we're getting our fair share. So I'm going to begin with the fully integrated model, and I'll describe these in very general terms. I'm sure people can take issue with them, but I think they're directionally correct. That in the up and through the 1970s, most of the innovation was funded by large corporations where they either made a discovery or they read about a discovery. They then designed products and services. They developed those and eventually distribute those around the country and around the world. The model was generally self-funded, so you had products that were producing cash flow that was reinvested into research, design, development, and so on. The end of that really started in the 70s when we changed the way we managed that research or discovery and design phase. And it started with bringing business practices and business leaders into companies that had generally been led by a scientist or an engineer. And we started to make a bigger focus on the marketing and sales part of that equation. And so when you think about management by objectives, quarterly reviews, all of the things that take place as a result of those policies that were brought in, it allowed marketing people like me to get in on the research discussions. And because of our ability to always communicate that we wanted what our competitor had but a little better, and we were very unexcited about what the new guys were coming in with. The other problem it created is that we were competing against each other. As a product manager, I was competing against 5 or 6 product managers for that budget. And so there was always, you know, the best presentation we could possibly put forward, but we also had to subtly undermine our counterparts in the room in order to win. And so that competition created almost an impossible scenario where you couldn't keep the products alive over 8 years of these quarterly reviews. You were sooner or later bound to be caught up, and people would lose interest, and we'd move on to the next exciting thing. So as a result, I think this model has undergone an awful lot of change and is no longer productive. It does work in a couple of instances, and I'll give you one or two, but if you think about Genentech and their success, it was because largely Art Levinson was the CEO, but he was also the product manager. They were his products, and he kept them alive. Same thing, Steve Jobs at Apple. He's the CEO, but he was really the product manager as the engineer. And you can go through others that were there. So that model, I think, has run its course, and fortunately, about the time that that started to happen in the 70s, along came the Bayh-Dole legislation, and we were able to take discoveries from federally funded research institutes, that's the FFRI, license those discoveries because the ownership of that had moved from the federal government to the institution, so we could take things that were formerly just published and actually create businesses around those discoveries. So the discovery happened, and then we moved to the design phase, which is largely what biotech or startup companies in life science did. They were able to either get seed money or venture money most often. They designed products from those discoveries, then moved them into product development, and you'll see along the bottom how those were funded. So from federal funding for the research to venture funding for the design and part of the development. And then there was the IPO, the public market opportunity to raise significant amounts of money after you had a couple rounds of venture. And that process created an awful lot of companies that were developing 1 or 2 key products and were moving forward as if they were all going to become Merck or Pfizer someday. And having been part of that, I grew up with how you did it was, you know, your initial funding, and then you tapped the public markets, and then you did a partnership and brought some more money in and some more follow-on financings and so on. But ultimately, you had to have a partner to distribute those products. So the co-partner or co-promote model was created, and many, many companies used that as a way to eventually lead to M&A. So if you think about all of biotech, there are very few that won't end up in M&A. I mean, Amgen is a standout. Genentech is now owned by Roche. Genzyme is now owned by Sanofi, and so on. So that you really see this as something that was enabled primarily because of vast amounts of money that you could access. So that model is undergoing some strain. I have shown this, a depiction here of the so-called Valley of Death, where the venture companies, because of the lack of this IPO market, which is, I think, gone and never coming back for pre-revenue companies, they have moved way, way upstream where they want to get things that are either in the clinic or ready for the clinic so they can do the clinical trials and then either move to M&A or in this case, primarily M&A, that they would fund that. The valley of death is real. There are many, many good discoveries that are not funded today because if you start a company today, you have to fund it all the way to profitability or to M&A. That's how it's going to be looked at. And that is a very, very tall order. So one of the concepts that has been developed, and there are several that I'll be talking about, one that I'll talk about, but there are several out there, is to think differently about this model and recognize that it only really worked when there was a robust IPO market or windows that opened where vast amounts of money were raised. This is the evolution that I have been thinking a lot about, and I call it the distributing partnering model. My co-author of a paper we wrote for the Kauffman Foundation, Pedro Cuatrecasas, was a very successful large pharma head of research. He had 40-some products that were marketed under his leadership, including Lipitor and others. And we sat down, and he had written quite a bit about the demise of big pharma's research and this fact that you had this management by objectives and you had business managers basically controlling the research budgets and impacting those in a way that he thought was unhealthy. We then came together and talked about, well, how would you do this differently if you had a blank sheet of paper? So I'll start with the federally funded research. The research has to be inefficient if it's going to be innovative, and therefore no timelines. People can pursue science, pursue wherever the data takes them without fear that they've got to go in a quarterly meeting and say, well, we've learned something new and we need to change that a little bit, but it's going to be okay. And you go through a few of those in those meetings, and those things ended up killed. Here you have freedom to pursue knowledge and take it wherever it leads. So from that comes what we'll call discoveries that I would state in most cases are not products. They enable you to make products, but somebody has to do the product definition. So hence the product definition company. These are product designers. These are people that will take those inventions, license them, and then do a prototype to prove that that technology can in fact work. It doesn't answer all the questions, but it answers a major set of questions. So if there are maybe 10 things you need to know about this discovery, maybe half or more of those will be paper exercises, but there's usually one or two that I refer to as the but for this, we could move. And that's what this phase is about. How do you prove and get through that one or two issues that if you solve those and you had the answer to those, you could then move forward. The value would be there. You lower risk, create higher value. So I call these product definition companies, and my thought behind this is that this is an investment from the investor standpoint in a management team, small, but the comprehensive knowledge of the team in terms of what are true innovations, what work needs to be done to lower the risk, and then pass those to people that will pay for the product development and those that will actually distribute. So this is a key area of this new model, that we're creating product design companies as opposed to a company around every product idea or every technology. It's a phase, and that phase would be sponsored by the product definition company and paid for as a part of an investment. So there's equity in the idea that will go to the institution, the inventor. There's equity that goes to the management team, and there's equity then that goes to the investors. But their idea is to do, $3 to $5 million per investment and do dozens of those and keep cranking out new product ideas that they have proof enough, all the things have been answered and so on. The next phase is then true product development. This could be, in our case, clinical trials. And venture capital may come in and say, we'll buy that from you, we'll put it through a phase 2B, and then our hope is at doing a portfolio of those that we'll have half or so that we can sell to the people that ultimately put these products on the market. And that's the large distribution companies. So the argument here is that if you break this down and you create a culture where every culture contributes exactly what they should, product definition, product development, and product distribution. The key to this, and the reason we couldn't do this 30 years ago and we can today, is the existence of what we call the production cluster or cloud. And this enables the product definition company to use those resources that are very efficient with a great deal of experience to get the data they need to allow that product to move to the development phase. And so selecting the people in the cloud that you're going to use is really key to how you're going to be able to move that upstream. They have the expertise, and what we're trying to do is figure out who do we use that can move that the quickest, the most proficiently with their discovery and actually add value. The other reason to do it in the cloud is that the people in the cloud are for hire. You can transfer very easily these ideas from one group to the next. If that expertise is in your building or in your people's heads, they aren't going with it. And that creates a big impediment to the next owner to own it. So next slide. If you look at the cloud and the kinds of things that I have in the cloud, you know, certainly intellectual property, you wouldn't want your own IP lawyer. You'd probably use somebody that is for hire in a law firm that specializes in that. Data capture is going to be key to a lot of this. Obviously, ShareVault is a data capture company, and one that, because these records and all that information has to be readily available. It can't be, you know, in paper files or, you know, a mess to get their hands on when they need that information. And you don't want them having to call the product definition company once it moves on from there. Regulation, formulation, preclinical, clinical, and even manufacturing, all being done in the cloud very efficiently without having, and getting the expertise of that to actually make the products better is really key. I want to explain this model a little bit using another sector that I've had the last several years a chance to get to know a lot better. And this sector, the wireless model, actually evolved into what I'm talking about, not because they had a grand plan for it, but because of competition. Competition and the speed of change ended up with organizations taking different roles and collaborating to develop a tremendous model that now is prolific throughout the world. So if you think about the discovery of the wireless, so GPS, CDMA, TDMA, all of those came out of federally funded research. They didn't come out of companies that were working on that and made those discoveries. But it was the product design people who actually could take those concepts and make chips that could in fact be used in cell phones. So if you think about Qualcomm or Broadcom, they're really product design companies. They continue to invest and develop new technologies that can be deployed upstream. So the next phase would be product development. Well, that's really making phones and computers and things like that. So Motorola, Research in Motion, HTC, Samsung would be examples of people who incorporate that new technology into devices that can actually be used by us to get that. The distribution is done by Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile, and so on. Almost all the work is done in the cloud, whether it's the fabrication, design, manufacturing. All of those products are largely made by people who are very, very proficient, who have a very high quality, and it's done in the cloud. And then one other major change to this was when Steve Jobs came along and introduced the iPhone. And so when the iPhone came, something else came with it, and that was the apps. So instead of Steve saying, gee, we're going to own all the applications, we're going to hire a legion of software engineers and write apps and sell those apps, he opened that up to app writers, people that write apps, and he shares the revenue with them by using his platform to distribute those. So he takes a piece of it, the app writers take a piece of it, and you get thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of entrepreneurs who are now contributing to a carrier. So when I think of our model, I think of Lilly and Pfizer and Merck and Johnson Johnson as being the BlackBerries, the Droids, and the iPhones. And the question I propose is, who's going to write the apps for them? And that's what I would think we have to focus on. We need apps. We don't need more. We don't need 100,000 droids or 100,000 iPhones. We need 100,000 products to reside on those delivery systems. So I'm going to summarize here, and then we can take some questions. But in terms of the distributed model, from the research standpoint, currently, I think we've done this right in the country, in that we fund federally funded research now is hitting $150 billion a year. It's inefficient, and it has to be. It focuses on the pursuit of knowledge, and it has freedom to do that. And it's really discovery. It's not products. It's enabling products and services to follow, but it's a discovery. The challenges are the people doing that work are not the people that have the translational skills or even the interest in developing the products from that. The technology transfer, we could talk at length about whether it's efficient or not. It needs to be efficient because it tends to be a barrier to getting good ideas in the hands of people who can actually move it forward. And then I've already discussed the valley of death problem, where it's just too early to start a company, too early to bring a real management team in, and there's a lack of funding to be able to do that, even if you could put that together, because this idea you have to fund to profitability. So the focus in the research area should remain as it is, and that's growing the federally funded research part of it and supporting the budgeting process, NIH, DARPA, National Science Foundation, on and on, to really make sure that we're continuing to produce those kinds of discoveries that lead next. The product definition is, you know, in the current, it's seed funding. It was follow-on rounds. Those rounds became very dilutive. And so if you invested early, you had to put away money so that you could remain an investor and owner of the organization or the product or the company down the road. We partnered for development and distribution, and then we had the IPO and eventually M&A. I think that model no longer works, and the challenges there are too early to start a company, dilution, and the exit. The focus has to be on sustainable financing models. I've proposed one. There are others that are emerging, but I think figuring out as a country how we do this is very important. The product development is, in the past, we put an enormous amount of money in very inefficient infrastructure. We all had our own everything at one time, our own vivariums, our own preclinical group, our own clinical group, our pilot plants, our manufacturing plants, our wet labs, and all of those were very inefficient because they were one-time use as you were moving upstream, but you had to keep all that there. That model is no longer fundable. The challenges to the product development phase is the dilution that I mentioned earlier. Probably the most difficult part of this whole thing is that at the end, in the late clinical trials, even if you can raise the money and go through all the dilution, is there comes a time when you have a binary risk. I went through that personally. I understand it. I remember going home the day we started phase 3 trials after 15 years and hundreds of millions of investment, and realizing how out of control, my control, that future was. And the chance that we would get it perfect, which it required, was not high. And I think that's the challenge we have with the model today. The other that I mentioned and hinted at, we have this horribly inefficient use of infrastructure that cannot be funded anymore. So the focus needs to be on capital efficiency there. Product distribution requires global infrastructure, focus on education and marketing, regulatory compliance. The challenge is that those companies, those large multinational distribution companies, lack innovation, particularly from their internal product development, and then they lack vertical integration as well. So the focus has to be on consolidation there, and you've witnessed that. You're going to continue to witness it, but it's really going to be how do they get more products on their platform in order to remain competitive. The production cluster, which I talked about, is viewed primarily in the beginning as contract services and a cost-plus business model. There are challenges that I think we need to address, not invented here. Anytime I outsourced anything in my company and it didn't go right, there was just this huge outcry about we cannot trust anybody on the outside. You know, you have to sort of get over that. It's that they have far more experience and far more knowledge. It's just that we don't tolerate their mistakes where we tolerated our own because they were us. The capacity challenge is you can't wait 6 months if you finally got your money and you need data to move your idea ahead. And then I think there's a lack of branding this very important component so that people understand what the production cluster is. And we certainly at Connect are working on some projects that that we think will be helpful there. And then there's this whole partner, innovate, facilitate. So the partnering is distributed. It's a different kind of partnering, but it allows everything to be in the same area. So if you think about the way it is today, discovery, define, develop, distribute, and under that very expensive and inefficient infrastructure, I think what needs to happen is that infrastructure has to move to the cloud, and it is, if you think about it, already beginning to happen. And we have to fix that one area, that definition. We have to think about how we create companies that write the apps that can be developed into products that can be distributed by the companies that are best aligned to do that. And the final thing is that the advantage of these is in the definition, the development, distribution, and the production cluster, each individually. There's a CEO that gets up every day and thinks about what they're doing and how they move that ahead. They don't have to think about 3 or 4 of these. I don't know many CEOs who go to work in large companies and ask for the quality assurance records and pore over those every morning when they go to the office. I think they pore over sales numbers, market share, will we make our quarterly earnings? And then when something happens in manufacturing or something doesn't go right, well, we're all over it. But then we find that our focus is what the company's focused on, not, you know, the manufacturing component and so on. When I first talked about this model, I suggested that if we weren't careful with how we handle this production cluster as a country, it would go the way of television sets and cell phones, and that somebody else would make it. And who announced 3 weeks ago that they're getting into the pharmaceutical biotech manufacturing area? Samsung. And you say, well, Samsung, what do they know about this? They looked at what we do and said, what a mess. What a mess. You guys are so inefficient, and your quality isn't even good. You say it's good, but that's just talk. You really don't understand quality. You really don't understand efficiency. You don't understand how to put these kinds of major facilities together where the CEO gets up every day and thinks about the quality of what they're providing. They cannot afford to have something go wrong. And I'll give you one example I read about when Apple did the i4. Foxconn, who assembled it, told the engineer at Apple, a new employee, that antenna was going to be a big problem, and begged them not to use it. And they were overridden. But the reason Foxconn did that is they didn't want them to be blamed for the problem, because they knew from their experience that in fact there was a problem with that. And that's what I'm talking about. When you have a CEO of everything, everything gets the focus it needs, the quality goes up because your stock and trade is what you deliver. It's not fully integrated, it's individualized and put together in one. So with that, I'm going to close the distributed party model. This is Kaufman published this article about a year ago that really outlines this. If you're interested in reading it, you can get it online at connect.org. So with that, let me go to the questions.
All right. We're actually going to take a couple of minutes and we'll show you just real briefly a ShareVault data room that's set up in the cloud to support Duane's distributed partnering model, and then we'll come right back to our questions and answers with Duane. So please go ahead and submit your questions now if you haven't done so already. What I'm going to show you, and again I just will take a couple of minutes, is how, if you've got all of these documents that are being created during each stage of the drug development process, and they're being done by different entities, you want to preserve that information across entities and have it in an available place and have a historical description of a historical record of those documents and who's been into them, as well as all of the questions and answers associated with the activity within each stage, within each entity. So I'm going to switch for a minute now, and I'll pause a moment and I'll show you just again real quickly here. Okay, so what you see now is the login to a ShareVault data room. I'm going to log in quickly. I'm going to select a particular company that we think of as maybe being in stage 3 in that third sort of development stage, or maybe it's in fact already been acquired by a big pharma company. But what you've got here is 4 different stages. You've got the research stage, that's the UC Bio Research Institute, where there was a set of documents developed. You've got Cell Tech Drug Design, that may be the design company. You've got New Wave Bio, that's the development company, and so this is the transition that you've gone that Duane outlined in each element of the distributed partnering model. There's a set of documents in this data room. There's 295 that actually exist, and it's a variety of different documents. You'll see some of them that are a whole variety of formats. There's Word documents, PDFs, PowerPoints, a variety of different documents. And each is tied into one of these phases. So for example, if I just wanted to see under the Bio Research Institute phase, we've got this financials. Again, there's some research, probably not a lot of financials. There may be some documents associated with grants that they received. There's clearly going to be some intellectual property documentation. There may be some operational information and some others. These are examples here. But if I want to look at the documents that are just associated with that phase, I now have 17 documents that tie back into the research stage. Similarly, as the drug development transitions from the research stage to the definition phase, to the design phase, you again have a new set of documents that you have immediate access to. And this is all organized in any kind of a form that you would like to organize. Certainly can go much deeper and much more extensively in terms of categories. But the nice thing as well is that in a data room you have access to any set of documents almost immediately. If, for example, you wanted to search for toxicity and see what was the toxicity record across each stage, just with a very quick search, you now have the access to documents that toxicity didn't show up during the research stage, but it does show up during the design stage, and it does show up later on maybe in the development stage. And so you have this visibility into particular elements just through a very sophisticated search mechanism. That's on the search page of a data room. In terms of the users and groups, and I won't be covering all of these tabs, but in terms of the users and groups, what you have is a record of each entity and all of the participants that you might have been interacting with. So you may have the regulatory advisors who have had access to this particular, there's the screen. So you may have the regulatory advisors, you may have the University Technology Licensing Office, you may have the venture capital firm and what they were, but you've got all of these different groups who at various times have had access to the documents. It might be that this One UC Bio Research Institute no longer has access to it, and in fact you would lock out those users who had been part of UC Bio Research. They generated the initial documents. They no longer have access to them, but you have that record of their participation and activity. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but again, there's a Q&A function so that any Q&A that happened between inside parties and outside parties here, that would be visible as well. And then finally, you have an activity list where you can see all of the documents that existed and who accessed those documents at any time. So if I go back in here, ignore the date and time, and want to select just UC Bio Research or just cell tech drug development, any of the particular groups, I can then get visibility. This display will show up just in a moment here, into a complete history starting from 2007 on. You'll see that there's a complete history here of all of the documents and what has been, what activity has been associated with those. So there may be some that are just viewed. There may be some that have been downloaded, but you know who did them and what time. You can always go back to that information. So let me pause the webinar again, just the display right now. And we're going to switch to the Q&A phase of our presentation. And so again, just to remind you, please feel free to submit the questions if you still have some that you want to ask. And let me bring up the questions that we've got here. So we've got a nice number. Duane?
So one question I get, and it's being asked here, who do I envision funding these product definition companies? So there's several possibilities here, and in fact there are some of these that are already emerging. But clearly the big pharma companies have an interest in seeing things being moved along. And I think that they in fact will be investors, much as they have in some VC firms and others, but even more directly investors in these product definition companies, where the bet is really on the people and the area of focus and expertise that those people have. I think angel investors could be a big part of this. I have trouble here at Connect if an angel investor comes to me and says, gee, I'd like to invest in cancer, and telling them, here are 10 cancer ideas, which we have right now, that we're working on. You could put $1 million in each one, but you would have to put $10 million away for each one for the future, because there will be follow-on rounds, versus telling that investor, invest in that team, invest your $10 million there, because A, I don't think they will lose your money, and B, and I think they'll in fact make money because they're aligned with you and with the research institute and the upstream need, where the venture capitalists want things ready for the clinic, and eventually the companies want that. So I think there's nice alignment there that says there's no dilution. You're betting on the team. You don't have to understand everything about cancer. They do. And so therefore I think they're a second possibility. Also, I think the traditional venture investors eventually could invest in these as well, where they're trying to figure out how the model is going to work better for them instead of the sort of time frames they have with venture capital. And finally, I think these companies could be public companies, could in fact raise money as a public company. So, you're going public means that you would behave like a public company and probably not trade until you've done 3 or 4 licenses that came in. So I think all of these are possibilities. So there's a question here about the payback period on these and how I would envision product definition companies. I believe for the most part they will sell these what I call IP companies, where they've put together the information for cash and a future royalty. There may be milestones in that too, but the main thing is to invest $3 to $5 million, lower the risk, and sell the winners for 10 to 20 million, because you're doing that in a couple of years of work, or you give the product back to the institute licensed because it didn't achieve its goals. But that kind of fast getting to the key information and getting that either sold or move on to the next one, I think is the key for that. So the payback should be fairly quickly, and there's no dilution. The minute you start saying, gee, if we just put another $5 million in, I think I could make this worth a lot more, I think that loses the focus you're going to need here in terms of what you do in design. So fairly fast payback, no dilution, and no, therefore, calls from your venture capitalist calls where you've got to put up yet more money to get to the next round. So there's another question here, and I get this occasionally. What kind of a split between the research institute, who has the discovery, the management team, and the investors? And I think it'll vary for the research and the investor and the inventor. Somewhere between 10 and 20% might be reasonable. At least that's reasonable in terms of the people I've talked to that would say that would be extremely interesting to them, as opposed to maybe someday down the road, if it all works out, I'll own 1% of the company. They would rather have their 10 or 15% now. For the management team, it's somewhere between 20 and 30%, depending on what their compensation might be, and the rest, of course, would be to the investors. But again, we're talking about singles and doubles, not home runs, and that's not what this model is about. It's about moving things down. Okay. So there's a question here on how is this model different than virtual companies? And I think the key one here is it's a portfolio. Too many of the things I see that are, quote, virtual, which use the cloud very efficiently, use that production cluster, and there's one or two people, they're a home run bet. You either, as an investor, that's got to work because there isn't anything else. Whereas this model calls for a portfolio that is being done. So you have the advantage of a team. This team would not be the same team you'd have on a single product. You have a very, very experienced team here that understands everything from the research all the way through the distribution and everything in between. So I think that's the difference, that you need a portfolio as opposed to I'm going to do this one product or this one project and hope that it all works out. So there's a question here about what are some biopharma production clusters currently operating. So I gave a list of those, but the production cluster increasingly consists of everything from a two-person operation that does one very specialized service to multinationals like Covance or others in the CRO field. It also consists of organizations like ShareVault. Without something like ShareVault, it's really tough to move this data and keep it all in one place. These things all have to be addressed in this model. You have to be efficient there, and you have to have a way to move that so that you're no longer necessary for that to move on. The minute you become necessary, that management team, that lowers the value of the product, because it means that there has to be some ongoing agreement and you're at risk. Whereas in the cloud, and you're actually doing your due diligence there, the members of that cloud actually help you add value to it because you're looked at as a third party. Even though your interest is there, you have such knowledge that you can communicate where you think this is going. There's an interesting question here about the wireless industry. Do they recognize where they are? If you talk to many of them, the answer is no. If you explain it the way I've diagrammed it out, it becomes pretty apparent that that's where they are. People think of Qualcomm or Broadcom as being big tech companies, Well, they're really big product definition companies. And if I think, and if you start talking that way, pretty soon they all understand pretty clearly what the model is. And it's interesting, one of those companies that is in that space talked about, they had a big argument whether they should use fabrication companies to develop their products. And they worried that they would teach them a lot about their technology. And in fact, they said they did. But they got back so much more as a result of what the production company taught them. And I think that's what pharma and bio and all the things that most of us grew up with have to get over, that these are real assets that are very efficient, who use infrastructure to 80-90% efficiency, where we used infrastructure at near zero, if not negative, in terms of what we invested in that versus just we needed data. I didn't need a vivarium. I needed, preclinical data. And so why did I build that instead of, not because those resources weren't available. Today they are. So I think that that's a big part of what happened also in the wireless area. Those resources were available, and people were making things for everybody, and therefore becoming much more efficient, and their focus every day when they got up was quality. So the question is on global distribution. And what do I mean by vertical? I think that in today's competitive world economy, that the only hope we have to remain on top of this is by having efficiency in all four of these areas. And as I said before, we, more than any other country, fund research. We, more than any other country, have venture capital. We, more than any other country, have multinational distribution capacity. The areas where we don't have, one is the, how do we fund and develop product design companies that need to fill that valley of death? And the other one is a rethinking about production. And that's where the competition beats us. They thought differently. They started from the beginning saying we're going to have unique production companies. So when South Korea started making TV sets, they didn't think about their own brand. They were thinking about how do I get RCA and Magnavox and others to come to us. And what was their stock and trade? People think often it was labor cost. It turned out after a while it had nothing to do with labor. It was the quality that you could get, the time frame that you could get scaled up and get a new model out. You couldn't possibly compete. Cell phones went the same way. And I think that's where pharma and bio are going to go, that you'll be able to go to people who do this for a business and get up every day trying to make the best quality product. They get efficient so the costs go down. They can handle huge capacities or small capacities, but they do it as a business. And I think that's another area that America has to focus on. So this is a question, Steve, maybe for you about confidentiality, because as I said, let me make a preference, and I want Steve to answer this, but the data has to be handled in a confidential way. So people say to me, that'll never happen in pharma. The most secretive company I've ever been across is Apple. And Apple uses all kinds of cloud companies to do their work. They do not do it in Carpinteria. That work is done across the world in plants that do lots of things for lots of people. So they've figured that out, and I think we will too. Steve, how do you keep that data confidential?
One of the things about using a data room, a virtual data room by its nature is set up to be a confidential environment in a variety of ways. First of all, the documents in there are secured and only accessible by the parties that own that particular data room at any period in time. And data rooms can get transferred from one entity to another. In fact, we see that sometimes when a company is acquired, that they may have set up the data room originally to secure their documents that are being shared with a prospective set of buyers. But eventually when a transaction takes place, that buyer may actually assume control over the data room and can continue the data room so that they've got the documents as well in the historical record there. The other way of protect, so you actually have control within a data room. It's one of the sophisticated capabilities of a data room like ShareVault. where you can define who gets to see what documents. People that no longer have access to documents can be excluded from having that access. So when you do the transfer from one entity to another, you would block the previous set of participants in the data room from having any further access if you chose to do that. And at the same time, you also have the ability to protect the documents that you're being shared, that are potentially being shared with other organizations in the production cluster that Duane described. So whether it's with CROs or CMOs or regulatory services, you would only share those documents that they are entitled to see, and they would only publish documents back into your data room, into your production cluster that are relevant to your particular entity. And all of those documents are totally secure. So you have a variety of ways of protecting the access to the documents, and then the documents themselves can be protected from printing or copying or saving, again, depending on the nature of the document and the type of communication that's going on. I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Really appreciate everybody's interest.
So there's another comment here about this sounds a lot like the model in streaming video and some other of the more high-tech internet capabilities. And the answer to that is it absolutely is. I think we, because of the way we develop these companies in pharma and biotech and medical devices and others, largely built around intellectual property, which allowed us to be rather inefficient as opposed to the companies that don't have that barrier. We also have the regulatory barrier, which takes a lot of time and increases costs. So as a result of that, we could get away with some real inefficiencies that these other industries could not withstand because of the speed of competition and the speed of the technology itself and how it was moving forward. So I think adopting and learning from them, at least in my experience here at Connect over the last 6 years, has just been a tremendous help to me to think outside of the norms that I was brought up in. So I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, people, for example, somebody said, well, there's innovation in the internet. You don't have these big consolidators and distributors. And I said, well, what do you think Google is today? And then they asked me a question, well, why would they be interested in buying Groupon? What is Groupon? It has no content. It has a sales force. It's a distribution company. So for Google to buy Groupon means they're buying that sales force. And that's what I think. If we need more distribution or specialized distribution, build distribution companies for that if there's a lack. But don't build one where you say I'm going to do innovation and product design and product development and then partner, and then eventually I'm going to build my sales force up and somebody's going to buy me. I'm going to go public or somebody's going to buy me. And then what are they going to do? Get rid of all the people, all the leases, all the equipment, all the stuff they don't want. They want your products. So let's build them products, not companies.
Okay, one question that showed up quite a bit was, will the slides be available? As I mentioned earlier, they will be available after the webinar in a few days. We'll be setting up a ShareVault data room. You'll get an invitation. All the attendees will get an invitation to the data room, and you'll be able to download the slides from that data room without any restriction. And also the webinar itself, the recording of this session, will be available on ShareVault's website also within a few days. And with that, I'd like to wrap up the webinar. Duane, thank you so much for your presentation today. It generated a ton of questions, way more than we could answer in time available today, but we really appreciate your putting this together for us. And thank you to all the attendees as well for your attendance and participation. We really appreciate your interest, and we'll let you know about future webinars as we schedule them as well. Thanks so much.